The fading sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Willow Creek, as Pearl Winters clutched her worn shawl tighter around her bruised shoulders, her life's belongings stuffed into a single carpet bag. The year was 1875, and the promise of a new beginning had drawn her to this frontier town like so many others before her. But unlike the hopeful faces that arrived on stagecoaches daily, Pearl's eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelties. Pearl winced as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her body aching from both the journey and the marks left by her former employer's heavy hand. She had fled Denver in the dead of night, leaving behind a position as a housekeeper that had quickly turned into something far more dangerous. Her employer, a wealthy businessman with a violent temper, had taken to beating her whenever his business dealings went sour. The final straw came when he had broken her wrist in a drunken rage. "Need help with that bag, madam?" the stagecoach driver asked, noticing her struggle. "No, thank you," Pearl replied softly, keeping her eyes downcast. "I can manage." The driver shrugged and turned his attention to the other passengers. Pearl took a deep breath and surveyed the main street of Willow Creek. The town was smaller than Denver but large enough to offer anonymity. Wooden buildings lined both sides of the dirt road, their facades weathered by the harsh Wyoming elements. A saloon, general store, and hotel stood proudly at the center of town, while smaller establishments dotted the periphery. Pearl had exactly $17.43 to her name, enough for a few nights at a modest boarding house and perhaps a simple meal. After that, she would need to find work. She headed toward a building with a sign that read, "Mrs. Holloway's Boarding House for Respectable Ladies." The proprietress, a stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, looked Pearl up and down with obvious suspicion. Pearl knew what she must look like: a fading bruise on her cheek, disheveled clothing, and the defeated posture of someone who had been broken more than once. "I have a single room available," Mrs. Holloway said after a moment. 50 cents a night, meals not included. I run a respectable establishment. No gentlemen callers, no drinking, and no coming in after 9 o'clock. Pearl nodded gratefully. "I understand, thank you." After settling into her small room, Pearl washed her face in the basin of cold water provided. The mirror above it revealed what she had been avoiding: her once pretty features now marred by fading yellow and purple bruises. Her honey-brown hair hung limply around her face, and her blue eyes had lost their spark. At 23, she looked a decade older. The next morning, Pearl set out to find employment. She had experience as a housekeeper, seamstress, and even as a teacher back east before circumstances had forced her westward. The general store had no positions available. The hotel manager took one look at her bruised face and declined her services, claiming guests preferred more presentable staff. By midday, Pearl's hope was fading. She stood outside the town's modest dressmaker's shop, gathering courage to inquire within, when she overheard two women talking as they walked past. "Did you hear about the Zimmer ranch? They're looking for a housekeeper again. Third one this year, quit last week." Not surprising. That place is too isolated, and Colton Zimmer barely speaks 2 words together. Strange man. Pearl's ears perked up at the mention of a potential position. She waited until the women had passed before entering the dressmaker's shop, not for employment but for information. The shop owner, a kindly woman named Mrs. Bennett, was more than willing to share what she knew. The Zimmer Ranch is about 5 miles north of town. Colton Zimmer inherited it from his father about 2 years ago, keeps to himself mostly, but he's honest in his dealings. Pays fair wages from what I hear. "Why do his housekeepers keep leaving?" Pearl asked cautiously. Mrs. Bennett shrugged. "The isolation, mostly. It's just him out there with a couple of ranch hands who have their own quarters. Some women find it unnerving being the only female for miles around. Others just can't stand his quietness. He's not mean, mind you, just reserved. Lost his mother young, and his father was a hard man. Didn't teach that boy much about social graces." Pearl considered this information. An isolated ranch with a taciturn employer sounded far preferable to her previous situation. At least a quiet man was unlikely to be a violent one. "How would I apply for the position?" she asked. Mrs. Bennet smiled. "He comes to town every Saturday for supplies. Tomorrow, in fact. Usually stops at the general store around noon." Pearl thanked the woman and left, hope rekindling in her chest. She would need to prepare herself, consider what to say, how to explain her appearance. She touched her cheek self-consciously, wondering if the bruises would fade enough by tomorrow. The following day, Pearl dressed in her cleanest dress, a simple brown calico that had seen better days but was at least presentable. She pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them and arranged her hair to partially cover the worst of the bruising. Then she made her way to the general store, arriving just before noon. She recognized Colton Zimmer the moment he walked in. He stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the weathered look of a man who spent his days under the open sky. His dark brown hair was slightly too long, brushing his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, though his expression remained guarded as he nodded a greeting to the shopkeeper. Pearl waited until he had finished his business before approaching him outside the store. He was loading supplies into a wagon when she cleared her throat. "Mr. Zimmer?" Her voice came out softer than intended. He turned, his deep green eyes assessing her with a quick glance. "Yes." "My name is Pearl Winters. I heard you might be in need of a housekeeper." She stood as straight as possible, trying to project capability despite her slight frame. Colton studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering briefly on the fading bruise on her cheek. His expression revealed nothing. "Can you cook?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir. I'm also experienced in cleaning, mending, and general household management. The ranch is isolated, 5 miles from town. Work starts at dawn, ends when the day's tasks are done. Sundays off if you want them." His words were clipped efficient. "Pay is $20 a month plus room and board." It was a fair offer, more than fair given her desperate circumstances. "When would you like me to start?" "Now, if you're ready, I'm heading back after this." He gestured to the wagon. Pearl hadn't expected such immediate employment, but she had nothing holding her in town. "I can gather my things and be ready in 15 minutes. Colton nodded once. "I'll wait." True to her word, Pearl returned quickly with her carpetbag. Mrs. Holloway had refunded half of her room payment with obvious relief. Clearly, Pearl's bruised appearance had made the other boarders uncomfortable. The ride to the Zimmer ranch was mostly silent. Colton occasionally pointed out landmarks or mentioned practical matters about the property, but he asked no personal questions, for which Pearl was grateful. She used the time to observe her new employer. His hands were calloused but gentle with the horses. His profile was strong, with a straight nose and firm jawline visible beneath his beard. There was something solid about him, something reliable that Pearl hadn't experienced in a man before. The ranch came into view as they crested a small hill, a modest but well-maintained main house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, and several outbuildings spread across the property. Fields stretched out on one side, while the other opened to grazing land where cattle dotted the landscape. In the distance, the majestic Rocky Mountains provided a dramatic backdrop. "It's beautiful," Pearl said honestly. Colton glanced at her, something like surprise flickering across his face before it resumed its stoic expression. "It serves its purpose." He showed her to a small but clean room at the back of the house, connected to the kitchen. "This is yours. Bathrooms down the hall. My room's upstairs. I take breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. Lunch depends on the work day." "And the other ranch hands?" Pearl asked. "Jake and Hector have quarters above the barn. They take most meals there except Sunday dinner, which is here." After showing her the rest of the house, Colton left her to settle in with a brief, "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." Pearl unpacked her meager belongings and surveyed her new domain. The kitchen was well equipped if a bit disorganized. The rest of the house was clean enough but lacked any feminine touches. No curtains at the windows, no decorative items, just functional furniture and the bare necessities. She spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring the kitchen and planning dinner. At precisely 7 o'clock, Colton returned to the house, washed up at the pump outside, and took his seat at the table. Pearl served a simple meal of beef stew, cornbread, and stewed apples made from the supplies she'd found in the pantry. Colton ate methodically, offering a brief "it's good" when Pearl nervously asked if the food was to his liking. The next few days established a routine. Pearl rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house, prepared lunch for Colton when he came in from the fields, then focused on laundry or baking in the afternoons before preparing dinner. Colton rarely spoke beyond necessary communication, but Pearl noticed he was unfailingly polite, always thanking her for meals and never raising his voice. On her 4th night at the ranch, a powerful thunderstorm rolled in. Pearl was in the kitchen preparing bread dough for the next day when a particularly loud crash of thunder startled her, causing her to drop the bowl. It shattered on the floor, sending flour and dough everywhere. "No," she gasped, immediately dropping to her knees to clean up the mess. Her hands trembled as she gathered the broken pieces, memories flooding back of her former employer's rage when she had broken one of his expensive whiskey glasses. She was so focused on cleaning quickly that she didn't hear Colton enter the kitchen until his boots appeared in her line of vision. Pearl flinched involuntarily, raising her arm in a defensive gesture before she could stop herself. There was a long pause, the only sound the rain pelting against the windows and Pearl's ragged breathing. "You're bleeding," Colton said quietly. Pearl looked down to see she had cut her palm on a shard of the bowl. "I'm sorry about the bowl," she whispered, eyes still downcast. "I'll replace it from my wages." "Look at me, Miss Winters." Colton's voice was gentle but firm. Slowly, Pearl raised her eyes to meet his. Instead of anger, she saw concern and something else, a deep understanding that made her throat tighten. Colton knelt down beside her, carefully taking her injured hand in his much larger one. "The bowl doesn't matter. Your hand needs tending." He helped her to her feet and guided her to sit at the kitchen table. Without a word, he retrieved a small medical kit from a cabinet, then pulled up a chair to sit across from her. With surprising gentleness for such large hands, he cleaned the cut, applied a salve, and wrapped it in a clean bandage. "Thank you," Pearl murmured, acutely aware of the warmth of his touch. Colton didn't release her hand immediately. "Who hurt you, Miss Winters?" His voice was low, but there was a current of anger beneath it, not directed at her, she realized, but at whoever had left those bruises. Pearl looked away. "It doesn't matter now, it matters." His thumb brushed across her knuckles so lightly she might have imagined it. Something about his quiet strength broke through the walls she had built around herself. "My previous employer, he had a temper, especially when he drank." Colton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "You're safe here, I give you my word." Their eyes met, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Pearl saw past Colton's stoic exterior to the man beneath, a man with his own pain, his own story. "I should clean this up," she said finally, gesturing to the mess on the floor. "We'll both clean it," Colton replied, standing and retrieving a broom. They worked in companionable silence, and Pearl felt something shift between them, a small bridge forming across the careful distance they had maintained. Over the following weeks, that bridge slowly strengthened. Colton began to linger at the table after meals, occasionally sharing stories about the ranch or asking Pearl's opinion on household matters. Pearl found herself looking forward to these moments, to the rare smiles that transformed his serious face, to the deep rumble of his laugh on the few occasions she managed to elicit it. As her bruises faded, so too did some of Pearl's wariness. She began adding personal touches to the house: wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains she sewed from fabric purchased with her first month's wages, a quilt she worked on in the evenings while Colton read by the fire. One Saturday in mid-June, nearly 2 months after Pearl's arrival, Colton surprised her by asking if she would like to accompany him to town for supplies. "I thought you might appreciate picking out some things for the kitchen yourself," he explained, a faint color rising in his cheeks. "And perhaps there are personal items you might need." Pearl accepted gratefully, and the trip to town became a monthly ritual. Willow Creek's residents quickly noticed the change in the normally solitary rancher. He spoke more, nodded greetings to people he had previously ignored, and was often seen carrying packages for his housekeeper as they visited various shops. Mrs. Bennett, the dressmaker, pulled Pearl aside during one such visit. My, you've worked wonders with that man," she whispered, watching as Colton politely conversed with the general store owner. "And you're looking much better yourself, dear. That ranch air must agree with you." Pearl blushed. "Mr. Zimmer is a good employer, Mrs." Bennett's knowing smile suggested she thought there might be more to it than that, but Pearl quickly changed the subject. The truth was, Pearl wasn't sure what was happening between them. There were moments his hand lingering when he passed her a dish at dinner, their fingers brushing as they both reached for the same book. The way his eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking that suggested Colton might feel something beyond employer and employee. But he never spoke of it, and Pearl was too uncertain of her own feelings, too scarred by her past, to bridge that final gap. July brought scorching heat and the annual town celebration for Independence Day. Colton surprised Pearl by asking if she would like to attend with him. "There's dancing," he added awkwardly. "And fireworks, I'm told." Pearl accepted, spending extra time preparing for the occasion. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that matched her eyes, and arranged her hair in a style she hadn't attempted since before her troubles began. When she descended the stairs, Colton was waiting by the door. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Is something wrong?" Pearl asked self-consciously. Colton cleared his throat. "No, you look very nice." The celebration was in full swing when they arrived. Lanterns hung from trees in the town square. A band played lively tunes, and tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes. Pearl noticed the curious glances and whispered conversations as she and Colton made their way through the crowd. "Everyone's staring," she murmured. "Let them," Colton replied simply. They enjoyed the festivities, sampling foods and exchanging pleasantries with neighbors. When the dancing began, Pearl expected Colton to retreat to the sidelines, but instead he turned to her with unexpected shyness. "Would you care to dance, Miss Winters?" "I would," she replied, surprised by his offer and by how much she wanted to accept it. Colton was not a practiced dancer, but he moved with natural grace, holding Pearl with respectful care. As they circled the makeshift dance floor, Pearl became aware of the solid strength of his arm around her waist, the clean scent of his soap, the slight roughness of his calloused hand holding hers. "I never thanked you properly," she said softly. "For what?" "For hiring me, for not asking questions when you clearly saw I was in trouble." Colton's eyes met hers. "Everyone deserves a second chance. I know something about needing one." "Your father," Pearl ventured, recalling bits of conversation where Colton had hinted at a difficult relationship. He nodded once. "He was a hard man to please. Nothing I did was ever good enough." His voice lowered. He used his fists to make his point when words didn't suffice. Pearl's heart ached at this revelation. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago." His hand tightened slightly on hers. "But it's why I recognized what you were running from the moment I saw you." The music slowed and other couples moved closer together. Colton maintained a respectful distance, but his eyes never left Pearl's face. "You're different now," he observed. "Stronger, you hold your head higher." Pearl hadn't realized the change in herself until he mentioned it. "I feel safer. I can breathe here." Something flickered in Colton's eyes, pleasure, perhaps, or relief. They continued dancing, gradually moving closer as the evening progressed, until Pearl could feel the steady beat of his heart against her own. The night ended with a display of fireworks, bursts of color illuminating the sky as townspeople gasped and applauded. Standing beside Colton, watching his face light up with each explosion of light. Pearl realized with sudden clarity that she was falling in love with this quiet, honorable man. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing with it the cattle roundup. For 2 weeks, Colton and his men worked from dawn until well after dusk, gathering cattle from the far reaches of the property. Pearl barely saw him except to provide meals, often delivered to the men in the field. On the final day of the roundup, a fierce storm blew in without warning. Pearl watched anxiously from the kitchen window as the sky darkened ominously. When Colton and his men hadn't returned by nightfall, she kept vigil by the window, a lantern burning brightly to guide them home. It was nearly midnight when she spotted riders approaching. They were moving slowly, and even through the rain, Pearl could see something was wrong. She grabbed a lantern and ran out onto the porch, heedless of the downpour. Colton was slumped in his saddle, supported by Jake riding alongside him. As they drew closer, Pearl saw blood mixing with the rain on Colton's face. "What happened?" she cried, rushing forward. "Horse spooked during the lightning," Jake explained grimly. "Threw him against a rock. He insisted on riding back himself, stubborn fool." They helped Colton into the house. His clothes were soaked through, and a nasty gash ran across his forehead. Pearl sent Jake to fetch the doctor from town while she helped Colton to his room. "I'm fine," he protested weakly as she helped him remove his sodden coat. "You most certainly are not," Pearl replied, her worry making her voice sharp. "You could have been killed." She helped him into dry clothes, trying to maintain his dignity while attending to his needs. The wound on his head was still bleeding, and Pearl cleaned it as best she could, applying pressure until it slowed. "You should sit down," Colton said, noticing her trembling hands. "You're shaking." "I was worried," she admitted, unable to meet his eyes, "when you didn't come back." Colton's hand covered hers where it rested on his chest. "I'll always come back, Pearl." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it made her look up. His eyes, despite the pain he must be feeling, were clear and intent on her face. "I'm not a man of many words," he said slowly, "but I need you to know something." Pearl held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid not to. "These past months having you here, it's the first time this house has felt like a home." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "The first time I've felt like I wasn't just existing." "Colton, let me finish, please." His hand tightened on hers. "I know you came here running from something. I know you've been hurt. I would never presume that you could feel for me what I've come to feel for you. But I want you to know that if you choose to stay, it would be as more than my housekeeper. It would be as my partner, my wife, if you'd have me." Pearl stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. "You want to marry me after knowing what happened to me, seeing how damaged I am?" Anger flashed briefly in Colton's eyes. "You are not damaged, Pearl Winters. You are the strongest, most graceful woman I've ever known. But my face, the bruises have faded. And even if they hadn't, they were never what I saw when I looked at you." His voice softened. "I saw your courage. Your kindness, the way you hum when you think no one's listening, the way you touch every new calf like it's a miracle." A tear slipped down Pearl's cheek. "I never thought anyone would want me again." "I do," Colton said simply. "I want you more than I've ever wanted anything in my life." The doctor arrived then, interrupting the moment. He stitched Colton's wound, pronounced him fortunate to have escaped with only a concussion, and ordered bed rest for at least 3 days. Once they were alone again, Pearl sat beside Colton's bed, holding his hand as he drifted towards sleep under the influence of the doctor's pain medication. "You didn't answer me," he murmured drowsily. Pearl leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips. "Yes," she whispered. "My answer is yes." Colton smiled, his eyes already closing. "Good, that's good." Pearl stayed by his side through the night, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, marveling at the turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been running for her life, certain that no man would ever want a woman as bruised and broken as she was. Now, she had found not just safety but love with a man who saw her strength rather than her scars. They were married the following month in a simple ceremony at the town church. Pearl wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Bennet had helped her make, and Colton wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. Jake and Hector stood as witnesses, along with Mrs. Bennet and a few other townspeople who had become friends. "I wrote something," Colton said quietly as they stood together before the minister. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I'm not good with words, but I wanted to say this right." Pearl watched, touched, as this strong, silent man unfolded the paper with slightly trembling hands. "Pearl," he began, his deep voice steady despite his nervousness. "Before you came to my door, I was a man living in shadows. The ranch was just land, the house just walls. You brought light back into my life. You showed me that a home is made of more than timber and nails, it's made of laughter and shared meals and someone to talk with at the end of a long day." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I promise to protect you, not because you need protecting, but because you deserve to feel safe. I promise to respect you as my equal partner in all things. I promise to love you through whatever storms come our way. And I promise that you will never again doubt your worth or question if you are wanted, because I want you, all of you, for all the days of my life." Pearl couldn't speak through her tears. Instead, she reached up to touch his face, communicating with her eyes what her voice couldn't express. The minister, understanding the moment, continued with the ceremony. Their first year of marriage brought challenges: a harsh winter that threatened the cattle, a brief illness that left Pearl bedridden for weeks, the adjustment of learning to live as partners rather than employer and employee. But it also brought joy. The expansion of the house to include a proper sitting room with large windows where Pearl could sew in the sunlight, the acquisition of neighboring land that made the Zimmer Ranch one of the most prosperous in the county and most precious of all, the news that Pearl was expecting their first child. On a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Pearl and Colton sat on the porch swing he had built for her, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Pearl's hand rested on her growing belly, and Colton's arm was wrapped securely around her shoulders. "I was thinking about the day we met," Pearl said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Do you remember what you asked me, if you could cook?" Colton replied with a chuckle. "And now look at us," she smiled up at him. "Sometimes I still can't believe it." "Believe what?" "That I found you, that you wanted me when I couldn't even see my own worth." Colton turned to face her, his expression serious. "I knew the moment I saw you standing outside that general store that you were special. It wasn't pity that made me hire you, Pearl. It was admiration. You were bruised but unbroken, afraid but still standing." He placed his hand over hers where it rested on her belly. "And now look at what we've built together. A home. A family." Pearl leaned forward to kiss him, savoring the tenderness between them that had only deepened with time. "I love you, Colton Zimmer, and I love you, Pearl Zimmer." His eyes crinkled with the smile that was no longer rare but freely given. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky, Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The bruises had long since faded from her skin, and the wounds in her heart had healed, leaving behind not scars but wisdom. She had learned that strength sometimes comes disguised as vulnerability, that safety can be found in the most unexpected places, and that love, real love, sees past the surface to the truth of a person's soul. In Colton's arms, under the vast Wyoming sky, Pearl had found not just a husband but a home, a place where she was valued, cherished, and above all, wanted exactly as she was.